this individual's parents are friends with the CEO of Special Olympics and just asked someone to write a letter. But this was a very in-depth letter that was perhaps the best recommendation I have ever read, and specifically called out this applicant as being a best in career candidate that the CEO of Special Olympics had worked with directly on some initiatives in a particular state or region. And I probably read that recommendation 7 or 8 years ago, and it still stays with me. So, the fact that the guy was a CEO is not what was compelling. It was the details that he shared about that particular candidate. So with that,
right.
I'll turn it back over to Donna.
Great. Yeah, no, and I myself have similar, there's just a couple that they do stand out. So let's talk about the 4 steps for you to get one of those 5-star recommendations. And I'll just kind of go over really quickly the 4 steps, and then I'll talk about them all in detail. So step 1, you really want to nurture the relationships that you have. Think about who it is that's in your potential set. You then want to think strategically about what you need, and then who is best able to amplify that story for you. You want to share the right information with your recommenders. And then once you've done that, you want to trust the process. So let me go into the first one and start in with that. So in terms of nurture the relationships, first step is identify that short list. And this is something that happens really could happen, you all on the call today, kudos, because this is the time you want to be identifying that short list. You have several months before applications are due. Ideally, one of these people is going to be your direct supervisor. And every now and then there's reasons why that would not be. So maybe your direct supervisor just started. Maybe you work at family business, and in which case you would want to get someone who's worked with you professionally to do that instead. If you don't pick your direct supervisor as one of them, just address why. And, and actually, this might actually be, sometimes we've done this in the past, Susan, the polls where we are kind of curious to see who has, maybe what are your concerns. So maybe this is a good place to just pop that in.
Let me do another quick poll first of who are you thinking about beyond your current supervisor to be a recommender, because you likely will need 2 unless you're applying to Ross or USC, but most schools are going to want 2. Options here: former immediate supervisor. You can click just one here: former immediate supervisor, a senior manager, a peer or colleague, or supervisor from perhaps an outside activity you're involved in, or a college professor or academic advisor. So I'll give you guys a minute to re-engage here and answer this question. As the votes come in, we have quite a few people thinking they would ask a former immediate supervisor. We had about 60% saying a former immediate supervisor, 30% saying a senior manager. We've got now 13% saying a peer or a colleague, and then less than 5% saying either a supervisor from an outside activity or a college professor or advisor. I'm going to just close that poll out. And one respect to these recommendations: what concerns do you have about getting a recommendation? And unfortunately, I didn't check these polls before, but you're going to select just one. You might have more than one concern. What are you most concerned about? You haven't asked anyone yet, and that's perfectly fine. It might jeopardize your position. Perhaps your manager is unfamiliar with an MBA. Perhaps your manager is not a native English speaker, or maybe you don't have any concerns at all, which would be fantastic. So I appreciate people voting here. This is going to be our last poll, so everyone participate. It's your last chance to participate in a poll. We've got about, as these votes are still coming in, about a quarter to 30% haven't asked anyone yet. About a third have concern that it might jeopardize their position. A little over 10% concern that their manager is not familiar with an MBA, and 10% as well manager's not a native English speaker, and about 15% say no concerns at all. So with that, I turn it back over to you, Donna.
Okay, great. So that's very helpful to have. There's a couple things just from that I want to definitely address. For example, the 13% who are, be very careful on the peer or colleague recommenders, because, from the admission side, most schools, that's probably one of the weaker ones, because having someone who's a peer, it's just not as powerful as someone who was in a senior role. And even if they weren't your direct supervisor, if they were in a supervisory role, supervised you on a project, that's all fine. But be concerned there. And then the 5% of you who are talking about school, people from school, that's also something that to be a little concerned about, because if you've been working for several years, unless you were doing like a PhD, and I did have a client last year who had a PhD and their thesis advisor turned out to be a real champion. But that's a case where someone worked, they had a 5-year relationship, very different than if you just have a favorite professor from a class you took 5 years ago. That is really not going to be a strong thing. So I encourage you to sort of think a little bit more on that short list. The next thing is really engage and assess the support. And I think the best way to do this is a face-to-face meeting. You really want to read between the lines here, because sometimes someone will say, yes, I will do. You ask them, they say yes, but when you can observe that body language, if you sense there's some hesitation somewhere in this, it's far better for you to identify a possibility of, a problem, and give them an out. So if they don't feel comfortable wanting to write that recommendation letter for you, you do not want to end up with a 5-sentence recommendation letter. And I know I have seen those, and I'm sure, Susan, you've seen them too, and you don't want that. So give the person an out and also assess that body language. And sometimes it's not the person that you would logically think it would be. I had a client last year, you'd think that the direct supervisor would have, and who happened to also be the CEO of the company, it was a small startup, was going to be the logical one of the recommenders. When there were some things going on in the company where that person was leaving soon, and it turned out that the founder who had hired her, so was also a supervisor role, was just a far better fit. So again, you really want to think about that, and I think face-to-face is often the best way to get all of the clues. When you're having that conversation, you want to solicit their feedback on potential growth. So for example, if you're having this conversation with your manager, and it's several months of when you're going to business school, you might even be able to identify in this conversation, gosh, I could use some more P&L experience or some more quantitative experience. Let's see what we can do over the next several months to be able to have me get some of that to help me. So the more you get someone sort of involved in, and also as they understand what it is that you want to do post-MBA, they can sort of help tell that story when they're writing the recommendations. So keep that in mind. And for those of you who are concerned about, again, you're tipping your hand too early, I also want to just maybe alleviate your concerns there to say that if you address that in an optional essay, the business schools have seen all kinds of scenarios. We recognize that some firms are more MBA friendly than others. And so I think that's the best way to handle that, is to just explain what into your choices. You want to cover all the bases. And by that, I mean, you want to try to ideally have these 2 recommendations tell different parts of yourself, so that if you have one recommender, maybe your direct supervisor, that can talk about your current, accomplishments, and then a former supervisor from another company talks about a different aspect. Or again, if you have a very strong extracurricular, maybe you're on the board of a nonprofit and you've really been able to be impactful, then that person from the other organization can tell a different side of you. So you want to think about that. And then I can't emphasize enough how important it is to provide sufficient time. So once you have selected that person, make sure they have at least 6 to 8 weeks to be able to get that recommendation written. Asking someone right after Thanksgiving to write you a bunch of recommendations, when they're all due January, the first week of January, is like giving someone a fruitcake that no one. So don't put that into a situation where you're sort of stacking the deck against you. And this is a good question to sort of have Susan chime in. I can think of some, but can you think of, some of those recommendations where they just were really brief and it did impact, the overall application because they weren't, they maybe didn't have enough time to do it right?
Yeah, one that actually stood out to me is more on when you talked about engaging and assessing someone's support. There was an recommendation I saw once where it was very, very short, but where the recommender could write any additional information. They wrote, please call me to get more information. And interestingly enough, we picked up the phone and called this recommender who was very hesitant to share some pretty serious issues that existed with that client, or that applicant rather, and we're willing to share it over the phone, but not in a written recommendation. Obviously that applicant had not done their homework in assessing the support that particular recommender might have for them through the process. There had been some legal issues that had gone down in that individual's place of work that had basically presented them in a really bad light, and the recommender shared that with us, and that was a fast pass to the ding pile, as Donna frequently says. So with that, back to you, Donna.
No. Okay. Yeah, no. And that's, so again, part of this is you have to use your EQ and really think about who is in your corner. So this leads into sort of point 2, think strategically. You really want to do a lot of introspection and self-reflection here. And this is both in terms of, realistically, where are you over and under the bar on your work experience, on your GPA, on your GMAT, and you're thinking what are those strengths and weaknesses, and who are the best people to tell, my story. And certainly if you know that there's a situation where you do not want a certain person involved in telling your story, you need to think about that and be aware of that. And this is certainly where MBA admissions consultants can help you think strategically about how you're seen by the school and what is needed to best support your overall application. Generally, you want to think about identifying what strengths you have. So, let's say that part of your post-MBA goal is you want to help businesses enter emerging markets. So as part of that, you want to think, who can really speak to my strong cross-cultural skills? Who's been able to observe that in my professional life? So you want to think like that. On the flip side, if your GMAT is low, who has observed, maybe a contribution that I've made at work quantitatively that would be able to address that? If I'm, the admissions person, when they're reading this and they see your GMAT score, they look at it all at the same time. If they have a concern or they see a grade where there's some quant concerns on the grades, they're seeing it. So and they're reading the recommendations and all of these things at the same time. So if then they're reading the recommendation and they can see that you have someone who has been able to address some successes quantitatively where you have done well, that's how your application can work synergistically, and you can really help to put all of the pieces together. You want to think about and share with your recommender, why do you want your MBA? And again, who can best support you? The other thing is your recommenders, and this is the best place if there is someone who can really speak to your character and your motivation and your integrity. That is definitely a place where the questions for the essays are rather, very specific, and there's not an opportunity to just share ancillary information. But if your recommender, for example, knows that you have been juggling a lot of balls in your personal life and been able to kind of handle your work professional, and they can share that, and anything that they can share that kind of humanizes you in the minds of the admissions committee, that's also a way that you can have the recommendations work synergistically. In terms of sharing the right information, so that's step 3. So now once you have your recommender, you want to follow up, then you can follow up with an email. And this is certainly where you can, give them all the kinds of information that you need. I had a client last year, and this is some of the kinds of things that she was sending to her recommenders. The why MBA, why now? So they really, again, have that conversation about why you need this, and then your recommender can help explain that when they're doing the recommendation. The post MBA goals, the resume, so that details about you are handy and at their fingertips, so that it's easier for them to be able to write the recommendations. Areas for improvement. So again, that self-awareness that you have, if you share that, then they'll have that in their mind as points that they want to be able to address. And as you're doing your own application, and you think about what are some of the key themes or things that you feel like are strengths that you want to highlight, you want to provide that and share some supporting examples so that your recommender has access to that. And this is a case where some of you mentioned that your manager was not familiar with MBA programs, or perhaps it doesn't know as much what to expect. So this is where it's helpful for you to put together some school-specific information. And for example, on most of the school's admissions websites, you can find a kind of what are the key criteria that they're looking for. And sometimes it's a very subtle thing, but it might give your recommender an idea of perhaps how to order and how to emphasize so that there's a best fit for each school. So for example, Stanford, when you look on their website, they will list that they're looking for intellectual vitality first, then demonstrated leadership potential, and personal qualities and contributions third. Whereas Harvard leads off with habit of leadership. So just having that available for your recommender to see, it might prompt the recommender, while they're not going to materially change who you are, they may lead off or maybe emphasize more how you've led in your work, perhaps how you've led on a committee or a social event at work, or just some different ways to show that, to tailor for the school. And then this last point is very important, so I want to give it plenty of time for you to write that address down. So AGAC is the Association of International Graduate Admissions Consultants, and they provide a link right here where it's advice that you can give to your recommender. And if you share that, first of all, if your recommender does not speak English well, so for those of you who are in Asia, perhaps if you do most of your work in a different language, you can actually click on the link for the language that you want your recommender to see if English is not their native language. And you can really, right up front, it just explains what's expected of the recommender. And that is that the recommender should be writing this letter, not you, that they understand how to be specific and how to quantify results wherever possible. It really just heads off, I think, a lot of problems for you to give that link to them to say, these are the expectations of what the school has, so that right up front, you're on the same playing field. Another tip, for those of you that have perhaps a boss or a recommender who is not as comfortable speaking English as a native language, you could have them do the recommendation in their native language and then have it translated. And that's certainly an option. And that way, they're not handicapped by being able to not have full command of the language. So keep that in mind. That's perfectly acceptable to do that. Susan, I don't know if you have any examples, clients that you've seen that have really, done a great job of prepping the recommenders and giving them the right information to do a good job.
Yeah, I worked with a client last year who worked for a nonprofit in kind of a non-traditional pre-MBA role. And her recommender was a little bit nervous and wasn't really sure what was expected. And my client put together a rather robust email that called out all these things of why she wanted an MBA, why now, really specifically why she was applying to the particular schools she was applying to, and what she hoped to accomplish through those and what her goals were moving forward. And that gave the recommender who was unfamiliar with the process a lot more confidence in being able to move forward and write the recommendation on her own. So it can really make a difference, especially if you're not in a role where your manager has done this on a regular basis. If you happen to be in investment banking or consulting, your managers do this year over year. So those you don't need
Right.
to worry about. But if you're from somewhere else, it's very helpful to kind of ease their concerns about what might be expected.
Great. Yeah, and that
Back
actually
to you,
reminds me
Donna.
of sometimes people feel like their recommenders need to have an MBA, or that they need to worry so much about what school their recommender went to. And really, from the recommendation standpoint, you should pick the people who best can give specific examples of your accomplishments and who have supervised you directly. And that's far more important than, again, the titles that they have in the company or where they went for their MBA. Certainly it's a bonus if your recommender has a relationship with that school. And in some cases, if there are relationships that you have with, let's say you have someone in your company that is senior to you that perhaps isn't the right person to recommend, to be one of your two main recommenders, you certainly could reach out to them and see if they would be willing to share something, maybe as an alum with the school, to be on the lookout for you and to share something about you that would not be one of your official recommendations. So there's certainly ways to handle that, but you should not feel like a great recommendation does not need to, it's not about the credentials of the person writing it. It's about how they have observed your work. That's really important. The fourth step really is to trust the process. So, once you provide all this information, and then you really do need to step back. You do not want to be, feeling like you're hovering or writing these. Really, the best letters, honestly, you can kind of just tell are written by the recommender, where they are reflecting. And in many cases, they will do a better job than you would have done, because they're going to, take this time, and if you give them enough time to do it well, they're able to bring in things that they've observed about you. And that is really it's not only the ethical thing, and it's also the best thing for you. Programs value integrity, and you certainly want to get off to a right start and do this the way the schools expect you to do this. So, and you want to be able to waive your rights. There's no really reason that you would not want to waive your rights. So that's important. Now, what is okay is certainly to check in with your recommender occasionally. And, it might not be such a bad idea to tell your recommenders that the recommendations are due perhaps a week before the actual deadline, just to build in a little slack. And if you see that maybe 2 weeks to go, that they're not, submitted, then certainly reach out and check in with your recommender, because you don't want to do that the day before it's due, because then there's not enough time to recover. If for some reason your recommender, perhaps it slipped their mind with the best of intentions. So certainly check in and pay attention to when those recommendations are complete from your portal, because usually you can see that. The other thing is that you want to demonstrate your gratitude. So you really want to thank the people, let them know what happened. Also, remember that this is a relationship that you want to build. So, think about how you can be helpful to your recommender maybe down the road. So at this point, and I think we're going to, we'll take some questions at the end, but let me just get to, first of all, just how can Stratus Admissions help you? So let me just tell you a little bit about what's next if you want to engage with us further. We do know that from this, again, this Association of International Graduate Admissions Consultants survey, less than 20% of successful MBA applicants did this on their own, meaning that people used a combination of sort of family, friends, and consultants. About 40% of people using consultants. And the benefit there is that consultants have seen so many scenarios, so many iterations of this, that it can be very helpful. That we know that from our clients who started 6 months ahead of submission deadlines, that they were 16% more likely to be admitted. And, with all of us at our Stratus team, not only do we have a lot of admissions committee and mentoring and coaching experience, but we also, all of our counselors with MBAs from top 20 programs have worked in diverse industries and functions. So, if you're looking to go into finance, some kind of finance or consulting, tech, energy, entrepreneurship, we have counselors who have had that experience that can be helpful in helping you as you go through this application process. The best way to reach out to really develop further and to get in depth about your situation is to do a free consult. We would talk about your short and long-term goals, evaluate your profile in the context of the competition, and discuss how your story takes shape with the help of Stratus. So I'm going to leave these numbers on the screen for you, because the phone number, the 646-690-7369, is a great way to reach out and start that process, or to email us at consult@stratusadmissions.com. You can also view our website. And I'm just going to read a little quote that one of our clients wrote about us, in terms of, my counselor and the Stratus team are amazing. It was one of the best decisions I ever made, and it was well worth it. Choosing to apply to business school is a huge decision and a big investment, and I would take countless hours consuming all the free webinars available. But it still did not get me to where I needed, and I'm glad I took the dive and worked with Stratus. I'm writing this review because I feel so blessed to be accepted, and that this is the only way I know to say thank you and pass on the greatness I experienced. So that's just to say that webinars like this, and we're definitely going to take some questions so we can get a little bit more in depth, but the best way to really, go deep into the specifics of your situation is to consider working with a consultant, and certainly reaching out for a free consult to kind of find out how that could work is a great way to test the waters and at least begin the conversation. So with that, let me see, Susan, do you have some questions that you're seeing that we can address here at this point? I'm not sure if I'm being heard. I'm not sure if anybody else can hear me at this point. Let me see. I'll see if I can go in and see if there's some questions. All right, let's see. Okay. Well, I'm hearing.
Sorry, I put myself on mute.
Oh, that's okay.
I put myself on mute. Thank you, Paul, and Philippe, who had lost us, who's back on. So Philippe had asked the question earlier on when I was sharing the specifics about this recommendation from a senior executive at Special Olympics. And, what were the details? They spoke to this individual's passion for their organization, the initiative that the applicant took in spearheading new projects for Special Olympics. And in this particular instance, the applicant's interest and connection with Special Olympics was due to having a sibling who had Downs. So we had that personal connection, and he, as a high schooler and as a college student, because this guy actually was applying to joint programs, JD MBA, directly out of undergrad, had been instrumental in building up some initiatives with Special Olympics. And the CEO of Special Olympics was aware of these, because it was things that had been brought to his attention, and it was initiatives that the CEO had participated in himself. So it's the specificity that is really compelling.
Yeah, and I'll chime. Oh, okay. I was going to say, Susan, I'll take a crack at that too, because I have, my own story that stands out. This is an application where it was a client actually who really, her title was somewhat of an administrative role. It did not, it wasn't her profile. When I was reading her package, did not appear to pop out. And then as I read the recommendation letter from the CEO of the company, and it really stood out because, and he gave I gave her this project to work on. And honestly, I didn't think she'd be able to, I just kind of wanted to see what she did, and she exceeded my expectations. And then he went into very specific details of how she did that, and was so effusive in terms of how much she had helped the company. It was a fairly small company, and was so was even willing to basically say, I'm willing to sponsor her for my MBA, for her MBA, because I am so impressed with all the things she did. So that took someone who, when I was just looking at their title and kind of reading what they said, the recommendation took this person to a whole nother level. And really, it was on the strength of that recommendation. And again, the specificity, really And it was, not that they need to be the great American novels. And sometimes some schools have word count limits, so you can't always write a 5-page recommendation. But I have seen some that are that long. And, again, the combination of the specificity and the passion that's coming through, those are the things that you're hoping that you're going to get from these recommenders.
Excellent. Great example there. All right, got a couple questions have come in. There are some that may be very personal in nature, and if you are one who submitted something that's kind of very specific to you, I encourage you to email us at consult@stratusadmissions.com so we can talk to you individually. But I will call out a few here. Paul wants to know, I have a supervisor who has known me for less than 6 months. Is that too short to ask him? So Donna, I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah. So less than 6 months, that's kind of, 6 months might be a watershed mark, I think, in some ways. And again, there's no absolute right and wrong, and you have to kind of use your gut. But if it's like 2 months, then I would say probably it is too short. In 6 months, you may have, if you feel like you've been able to, work on some projects and have some good results, and you've had some conversations already where, perhaps you've had a mid-year review and you feel you have a good sense of how your supervisor sees you, then it might be fine. And remember, by the time you are actually, if you're several months out from the actual submission, it might be 9 months by the time this person gets around to writing it and it becomes live. So if you're nearing that level, then I would say, that sounds fine. But if it's, again, 1 or 2 months or something there, then I would say it certainly would be reasonable to ask a previous supervisor and just explain that in your optional essay.
Yep, great answer. I'm going to just add to that for you, Paul, and for all of you who might be in that similar situation. When you are on that cusp of, I'm not sure if it's enough or a little, that's where you can make the judgment call as to, is my new supervisor who's known me for only 6 or 8 months going to write me a better recommendation than my previous supervisor? And you can leverage the optional essay to explain why you picked one over the other. If you're beyond the kind of 9-month mark, you don't have that option of saying, I haven't worked with this person long enough. But that actually plays into another question that we have from Jacob, who wants to know, he works for a company where he doesn't have one direct supervisor. He might work with one manager for 6 weeks and then go a whole nother year before working with that person again. Therefore, there's no one person who has a full picture of his accomplishments and involvement. What's the advice for applicants in this situation? So Donna, I'll let you answer that.
Okay. So I think in that sense, to dovetail on what Susan just said, in a way that's good, because you can drive that process a little bit more and think about who of the people you've worked with, perhaps, on a project that you feel like you want to highlight that perhaps plays into some of the strengths that you want to be, amplified in your application. So you really need to think strategically about, again, which person is going to be best able to tell the stories that you think are most impactful. And then also using that EQ, again, is somebody a great writer and somebody's not a great writer? Is somebody going through something in their personal life over the next several months where you could see that is a problem to get them involved? So that's where I think, and as long as that person that you're getting to write the recommendation has supervised you on some level, and certainly there are organizations where you have more of a matrix reporting schedule where you work with someone on one thing, as long as they can say that they supervised you in some way, that to me was, that's enough. And so I think you're fortunate in that you can probably have some more latitude as to, who you pick and what you want to share. So that's how I would say there.
Excellent. Great answer. Thank you, Donna. Yeah, I've had some clients who are in similar situations, Jacob, and having different supervisors over the course of the year allows you to pick amongst, you might have 6 or 8 different supervisors, and you can pick the best 2. And in your optional essay, explain, that you have different supervisors and, explain why you picked the 2 that you picked. Ashley has a question. I work in a non-traditional background and have had only 2 supervisors. Is it okay to ask them to do all my recs, or do people give different recs to several recommenders? So I think the question is, if Ashley's applying to 3 or 4 schools, should the 2 same two people write all of her recommendations for each of those schools. So on to you, Donna.
Yeah, and so I think that's, I think it's thoughtful of you to be kind of aware of how much am I asking any one person to do. But I will say is if you put it all together in a package, again, here's the information about this school, here's the information about this school, really it's not the sort of the effort involved to get one person to do one or two more is not so much as opposed to kind of starting this whole process with someone else. If for some reason there's a particular school where you think, again, there's maybe an alum that you have a connection to, you might want to, swap out someone for one school versus another school. So certainly those are individual strategy things that you can make those decisions. But I think most people, if they're writing your recommendations for business school, if you're looking at 5 or 6 schools, that again, as long as you give them the time up front, you're not dumping this on them at the last minute. It's kind of part of the process, and it's not going to be that they have to radically recreate different, you're not a different person materially in the eyes of different schools. It may just be slight emphasis or perhaps what they lead with, but I don't see that as, I wouldn't worry too much about that. Certainly not to sacrifice getting a subpar recommender just to sort of feel that. And this is where, get them a great gift, get them a gift certificate to a nice restaurant, be very appreciative. And I think, most people who use recommenders, those recommenders are writing it for several schools, not just one.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on what Donna said about getting a nice gift certificate or something. I've worked with a client who worked in a consulting firm where, was submitting applications first of the year. So asking a manager to write recommendations kind of around the holiday season. And this was, a very busy manager. And what the client did was the client made sure to spend time with the manager's administrative assistant and ask the administrative assistant to block time on that manager's calendar, and then made sure that when that time was blocked, an hour on a Friday afternoon, a week before Christmas, to work on that client's recommendations, he went and stood with the administrative assistant, probably with a box of chocolates or flowers or something, to ensure that the manager was doing what he or she was supposed to be doing during that time. So think creatively as to how you get through and make sure that the manager has the time to do what you're asking them to do, and be grateful for what they're doing for you. All right, let's see, another question here. I'll take this one. Paul wants to know, during the application process, when they provide 2 recommender emails in a portal, and then find out perhaps that one of them is not able to do a recommendation, is there a way to change it? Yeah, this does come up, Paul. And in this instance, sometimes you can go back into the application portal and just change the recommender. In other instances, you may need to reach out to the school and ask for them to change it. It might not be something that you are able to change once it's been submitted. All right. We've got a question from Rolanda, who wants to know how to select recommenders for the HBS 2+2 program with limited work experience. And there's not a professor who knows them or their story personally. So for those unfamiliar, I'll take this one because I just worked with an on 2+2. For those unfamiliar with 2+2 at Harvard, it is an opportunity for people who are undergrads or went straight from undergrad into a master's program to apply to Harvard while they are still in school, before they have started any full-time employment. And the idea is that you might be accepted to Harvard and you start 2 or 3 years later. So the expectation is you will go and work for a few years before you start the HBS MBA program. So I hope, Rolanda, that you have had some sort of work experience, an internship perhaps, or perhaps there is some outside activity where you have demonstrated leadership, perhaps at your school it might be in the debate club where you have a leadership role. You might be in student government. You might be in a leadership role in a fraternity or a sorority. Think about people who you have worked with and observed you in a leadership role outside of the classroom. Professors, again, are not the best people to write recommendations, even if you're applying to HBS 2+2, where you wouldn't necessarily have a lot of formal work experience. Let's see, for another question, we probably have time for one or two more. I ask those of you who are with us to stay on. We have a quick survey for you to do when we wrap up. Juliet wants to know, at her last performance review, her manager indicated that she would be put up for promotion this year. She works for a large bank. If I asked her to write a recommendation, could I somehow ask her to mention this in the recommendation? She's planning on applying round one and would be submitting the application before the promotion occurs, which would, I guess, happen in Q4. Mm-hmm. So, okay, sure, Juliet, and let Donna take that one.
Yeah. So I think that's a great point you're bringing up, because I know that when I was reading recommendations, I really liked to see from the recommender the validation. So sometimes people will put on their resume, promoted ahead of schedule or something like that. It meant far more when it was on the recommendation, when those kinds of and also if you can get your recommender to say what it is about your performance that is prompting that promotion. So absolutely, in the conversation, you would say, in talking about why you've been impactful, to mention that there's an upcoming promotion, that they, see these qualities in you, and listing what those are, and maybe even listing the details of some of the, deals that you were involved in that are part of the prompting for that promotion. So absolutely, even if it hasn't happened yet, to know that it's on the horizon, and to have your recommenders talk about your progression and comparing you to others in your peer group, that is very helpful. And if your recommender has been able to, has been working with associates for 15 years, and in all the 15 years that you are in the top, 5% or the top 2%, that is also great for them to give context, because again, it says, wow, this person is, it's not their first rodeo. They've actually got a lot of, people, they're comparing this situation to a lot of other situations. So it adds credibility to their statements to have them do that. And some of those tips are actually.
All right, I think I lost Donna there.
Yes. No, I'm here. I was just saying some of those. Let you go ahead and take over. Yeah.
One last question here. Philippe is changing jobs around September. Wants to know, she skipped round one across all schools and go for round two in order to be able to have time to get a recommendation from the new job. I'll let you take that one.
Okay. Yeah. That depends. Yeah. It really does depend. I mean, in general, I would say changing jobs right at the cusp of applying to business school is not ideal. That being said, life happens for lots, there's lots of scenarios. And I think it really would be, I don't even know that I would officially make that the driver of why I avoided round one, but I would perhaps, this is something that you have to assess. Again, where do you think you're going to get the strongest recommender? But if you obviously left your previous job on good terms, and there was someone that you worked with who can explain your, accomplishments and really share, and it may be that you're saying, before business school, I want to have this other experience, which is going to help, get me to that, my post MBA goal, and I wanted to take advantage of that. Then, that you may be able to have a scenario where you just proceed on with round one, even though you have a new job, and you've just, again, because it's been less than a couple of months that the new person supervised you, you just are leaning on those prior supervisors. So I don't know that I would absolutely say that you have to have your current new job recommend you. And if you're not going to start the new job until September, then even if you're getting your recommendations together for round 2, you're going to be doing that in November at the latest anyway. So you're not going to have a whole lot of time for that new supervisor to have built up a lot of, ability to be able to put a strong recommendation if you've been working in your previous job for several years. So I think there's a way to manage every situation. That might be a situation where you might want to follow up with us afterwards, but that I would not absolutely say you have to even delay the round because of that scenario. Susan, do you have anything else to add to that?
I think that was a great answer. And we are right at 1 o'clock. So I think there are a few questions that we didn't get to answer. Lola, Brian, Aaron, reach out to us at consult@stratusadmissions.com and we can answer those questions individually. But I want to thank you all for joining us. And thanks Donna for her time today. We appreciate you being with us and we hope to hear from you. And wish you all the best as you work forward towards your MBA application. And last word from Donna, and then we're going to sign out.
Yeah, no, just I want to wish each of you the best of luck in your upcoming MBA applications. The fact that you're on this call, well ahead of time, you can leverage the information that you learned today and begin setting up those meetings with your potential recommenders and really doing your due diligence so that you can pick the strongest people in your arsenal. And remember, there's a lot of options. So really think through strategically who you select. And again, wish you the best and would love to have you reach out to learn more about Stratus. So thanks so much for listening.